have some idea about the environmental impact assessment. The objective of EIA is to identify, predict, and evaluate the economic, environmental, and social impact of a development activity, to provide information on environmental consequences for decision making, and to promote environmentally sound and sustainable development through identification of appropriate alternatives and mitigation measures. One of the components of EIA is public consultation or public involvement. Involvement of the people is one of the fundamental principles of EIA. It not only provides an opportunity to those directly affected by a project to express their views on the environmental and social impact of the proposal, but also brings about transparency in the environmental clearance system. Throughout the world, EIA system has two kinds of public involvement. One is consultation. It is some kind of dialogue. And another is public participation, which is more interactive and intensive process of stakeholder engagement. Are undertaken either through public consultation or public involvement. Public consultation refers to process by which the concern of local people regarding the adverse impact of a project are ascertained and taken into EIA study. This concept was legally introduced in India in the form of public hearing in 1997. Since then, the public hearing process has been conducted as a mandatory step for environmental clearance for most projects and activities. Now, the reason for this evening webinar is our experience. The experience in the developing world is not good, the way EIA has been conducted. So therefore, one of the objective of this evening webinar is to have some kind of comparison between how public hearing is conducted in developing world and how public hearing is conducted in developed world. And what are the steps which we need to take to strengthen the public consultation, the public hearing process in our part of the world. This evening, I have with me Ms. Hanna Sofia Johannesson, Senior Advisor, Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. Tail Kazumba, she is from NEPA, US EPA. Ms. Cindy Barger, Director, NEPA Compliance Division, US EPA. We also have Mr. Ebenezer Appa Sempong. He is Deputy Executive Director, Environmental Protection Agency, Ghana. And I also have with me my colleague Isita Garg, Deputy Program Manager, Center for Science and Environment. Now, I would like to request Isita to share her presentation on how public consultation, how our experience is with the public consultation process. It's up to you, Isita.
Thank you, Navid sir, for giving me the platform. I'll just share my presentation. So through my presentation, I'll just take you along to the instrument of public consultation in India. As Navid sir has given an introduction, that public consultation is an important part of an EIA process and is generally performed in two steps. Firstly, the public hearing for local people as in the people who are directly associated with the proposed project site. And secondly, through the written comments from the other stakeholders who can be directly or indirectly be affected by the proposed project. But before going further, let's see where in the whole EIA process the public consultation step takes place.
Isita,
Yes, sir.
we are not able to see your presentation.
Just a second, sir. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So before going further, let's first see where in the whole EIA process the public consultation step involves. As we have seen, first the idea or the concept of the projects, as we say, and the site selection has been done. According to that, a proposal for the project is being prepared. Now, if a project is category A, it's get clearance from the center, that is Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And if it's a category B project, it gets clearance from the State Appraisal Committee. These projects are being submitted to their respective agencies. And once the project is submitted, the project goes through the screening process. The screening step is applicable only to category B projects, wherein it's been decided whether a project requires an EIA or not, depending upon its impact on the surroundings. Once the screening step has been done, the category A projects and category B1 projects goes for the scoping step. In this step, a detailed terms of reference has been awarded to the project, on the basis of which the EIA report is to be prepared. Once this step is done, the actual impact assessment for the project is performed, wherein the baseline monitoring is done and what are the impacts that are associated with the project are assessed. Once all is done, a draft EIA report is prepared, and now this draft report is shared with the local public for their feedback and consultation. After the consultation thing, the EIA report is submitted to the appraisal committee for their final approval. As we can see from this flow chart, a step just before the final approval from the committee, the EIA report has been submitted to the public for their comments and feedback. Now, if we first see what was the objective of including public hearing in this EIA process, the motive was very clear, just to raise the awareness about the possible impacts of the project to the local people. Secondly, to give opportunity to the local community to provide their feedback regarding the proposed proposal. And the most importantly, to incorporate the local information. As we know, the local people are the best judge about the surroundings of the area. So by discussing the project with them, the project proponent may get beneficial information for them to get incorporated in the report. Now, as per our EIA notification, the public hearing process includes following steps. Firstly, a notice for public hearing is to be placed in one national daily and one regional vernacular daily newspaper, wherein the details about the venue and the date of the public hearing is being shared. Then the local community is given minimum 30 days to respond to the draft EIA report. On the day of the public hearing, the video recording of the is to be conducted. Once the public hearing is concluded, all the responses are to be noted down and read out to the audience in vernacular language, and minutes are sent to the respective state pollution control board. Now, this is the process which ideally needs to be followed as per the EIA notification. But recently, it has been observed that the project proponent are finding out different ways and measures to get away with this public hearing. We'll discuss few of the practices that are being done currently. The foremost and the most popular one is the inadequate information in the EIA report. It has been observed that the EIA report generally doesn't talk much about the environment sensitive areas around the project. The objective may be clear that the appraisal committee should be put in dark to address the impacts that can affect the surroundings of the project. We can have a clear example of a Nirma project in Gujarat, wherein the EIA report does not disclose the presence of a water body in the proposed plant premises, due to which there was a huge protest by the local people against the project. To add on to that, the feedback and the objections made by the public during the public hearing were not even incorporated in the MOM and then in the EIA. The objective again was to keep the appraisal committee in dark about the objections of the people. The second method which is being used is by inappropriate venue of hearing. For example, in 2010, the public hearing of two different projects, that is Adani Mundra and KPGL power plant, were fixed on the same venue and same date. Likewise, for a limestone mining project in Jaisalmer, the public hearing venue was decided 60 kilometers away from the project site, where there was only one bus in a day to reach the site. What was the objective? It's clear: to refrain project affected people from reaching the venue and put on their feedback, their grievances against the project. Now, if we talk about the ways to get away with the public hearing, it's not only the project proponents who are practicing it. Somewhere it's been observed that government also wants to get away with public hearing process, wants to lessen the involvement of public in the project approval thing. For the same, like, government has now and again passed an order various projects from public hearing. For example, in 2017, expansion of coal mining projects up to 40% capacity were exempted from public hearing. Then again, in January 2020, hydrocarbon exploration activities were exempted from both EIA and the public hearing. The final blow was the draft EIA notification 2020, wherein the government has exempted a list of projects from the public hearing. These projects include modernization of irrigation projects, building and construction and area development projects, expansion or widening of national highways, and all projects concerning to national defense and other strategic considerations. Apart from the exemption to the projects, there is one more practice, and that is the most questionable one, is the project are getting clearance even after it's been rejected by the public. The foremost example for this thing is the Dibang hydropower project in Arunachal Pradesh. The foundation stone was laid in 2008. However, there was a strong opposition by local tribes and various stakeholders. Reason being, the project was proposed in a biodiversity-rich area, and people were opposing that the dam will destruct the rich biodiversity. The project even got rejected twice by the Forest Appraisal Committee, stating that fallout of the project on such rich diversity zone would be such that regaining it may be very difficult through any type of mitigation measures. However, after all these rejection and opposition from the people, after 11 years of such fight, the project gets a go-ahead from the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs in 2019. So, looking at all these things, CSE feels that the objective of public hearing is being missed out somehow in the whole EIA process. And if we really want to make the EIA process effective, this step needs an utmost attention at this point of time. For this, CSE suggests or recommends following steps to strengthen the public hearing. Firstly, we propose that a live streaming of the proceedings of public hearing should be done, so that people who are unable to reach to the site can attend the public hearing from distant places as well. Secondly, all information pertaining to the concerns raised in public hearing should be put in public domain, so that to maintain the transparency among the public. Thirdly, when project is clear, the report back on people's consent should be made available, stating what people have said and what was taken into account. Thirdly, what CSE feels is that there is no provision to ensure that voices are heard before project is clear. The public hearing is conducted, the minutes are being taken, but how to ensure that the grievances are addressed, have been taken into account, and actions have been uh, shown in the EIA report. So there should be some provision to ensure that these comments are made into the public domain. Apart from this, CSE feels that the whole process should not be confined to the public consultation, but it should be the public assessment. The public should assess the project at various stages of the project. It's not a one-day job. It's not after the complete EIA process is done and the public is asked for their feedback. In fact, to gain the confidence of the public, they should get involved in every step of the project. CSE recommends an inclusive development. The development is not only for the people or the higher officials, but it should trickle down to the local stakeholders to get an fruitful result. With this, I'll end my presentation and I'll give the stage back to Nivit sir for further proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Isita, and thank you very much for highlighting the limitation which public consultation process has in our part of the world. I have just seen a comment by Mr. Paristo Tyagi ji. I understand, Mr. Tyagi ji, Isita have made some mistake with procedural matter, but like these are minor things. Let's discuss how to strengthen the process. I am waiting for your comment on the same. Now, next I would like to invite Ms. Hanna from Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. Please share your presentation.
Thank you.
Ms. Hanna.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see if I can share this one.
Please enlarge. Yeah, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the Swedish EIA process, and I'm going to use the siting of a spent nuclear fuel as an example, because that's what my research used to be about. So the Swedish EIA system, we have the environmental code, and that states that the operator has to apply for starting the operation or build the facility. And the decision about the operation of facility is made by the government, environmental court, the country administration board, or municipality. It depends on the scope of the planned facility. And the operator has to carry out a public consultation process. And the documentation of a public consultation process has to be attached to the operator's application. So simply we have to do this, whether we want or not. There are a few regulations of a public consultation process in Sweden. And it states that the operator has to consult with the country administration board, the authority in charge of area affected, the municipality where the operation of facility is planned to be located, and the parts of the public that is particularly concerned by the planned operation of facility, and organizations that are particularly concerned by the operation of facility, usually environmental organizations. And it also states that a public consultation should be carried out at an early stage of the EIA process. But there are no regulations of how the public consultation should be carried out. So there are lots of questions raised to this, like how early is early in a process? And how should a public consultation process be arranged in order to be democratic? And what is typical for democratic decision-making anyways? And what is a democratic dialogue? So I will say something shortly about this. So why did I choose the handling of the Swedish nuclear waste? Well, that's the most extensive EIA process in Sweden. And there's a company called SKB, which is in charge of handling the spent nuclear fuel. But anyways, so SKB, they decided that public consultations are meetings with people living nearby the proposed plant and environmental organizations. And they also decided that public consultations are written communication between public living nearby the plant site and environmental organizations. And we also decided that organizing study trips to their already existing facilities in relation to spent nuclear fuel also is public consultation. That's an interesting interpretation. But anyways, but what is democratic decision making? I am a political scientist, so I'm really interested in things about democracy. But as we all know, the EIA and especially the public consultations are meant to guarantee a democratic process and public influence. But there are many different kinds of democracy. And the most common one we are thinking about is representative democracy, where political decisions are made by elected representatives and the public elects the representatives and have the right to vote. And we also have a right to public participation in public policies and public discussions. And then we have discursive democracy, which is based on discussions and dialogue. So that is recognized by public participation in public dialogues, but also rational arguments are favored in the dialogue. So it's actually a favorism of academics and experts. And there also have to be arenas where the participants can meet and discuss. And then we have technocracy, and if you prefer technocracy, then the decisions should be made by experts and scientists, and politicians should make the decisions based on expert argument. And the public only have a minor part in that kind of democracy. So I studied the siting process of Swedish nuclear waste. So these are what I'm thinking about after doing that for 7 years. So I think the public consultation meetings, the main problem when it comes to representative democracy is that very few, or if any, elected representatives, politicians participated. A few local politicians, but no national politicians. So actually the public consultation meetings and the representative democracy is a very weak link or connection between them. And when it comes to discursive democracy, the main problem for me when I studied that is that the public living nearby the proposed site for the nuclear waste, they were invited, which is good, but they are mainly laymen. And at the same time, also environmental organizations were invited, but many of their members are experts and academics. So I saw a risk for that the experts and academics from the organizations and SKB, the company, are discussing using rational arguments difficult to understand for the public, which is supposed to live nearby the nuclear waste. And also there's another problem here. SKB, we have to decide the arena and time for public consultation. And I will explain the football here, because SKB once invited to a public consultation meeting and no one showed up, because they happened to organize that meeting at the same time as the Swedish national soccer team was playing. So people prefer to watch soccer instead of going to a public consultation meeting, which is problematic in many ways. Anyways, so. And there's also a tendency towards technocracy on these meetings, because most of the discussions were based on scientific arguments regarding different methods of how to handle the spent clear new fuel, rather than questions raised by the public. So actually, these meetings can be more like arenas for expert discourse rather than a democratic dialogue. And when it comes to written public consultation, that's maybe even more problematic, I would say, because here is no representative democracy at all, because no politicians, but written communication between the environmental organizations and SKB. And when it comes to having a dialogue or a discourse, it's even maybe more complicated, because how can we have a dialogue between all stakeholders, the public, organizations, authorities, SKB, when it's a one-way communication, because the organizations emailed or mailed their opinion to SKB and SKB replied. So I would say that this is more like a technocracy. Experts from the environmental organizations mailed SKB and SKB replied. I would call that not a democracy, rather a one-way elitist communication. Trips are maybe even more problematic. Because SKB, they offered people living nearby already existing facilities to travel to another municipality and check out their facilities, like a study trip. And I would say the representative democracy here is also really weak, because politicians didn't participate on the vast majority of these study trips. So it's, I would say, hardly any representative democracy. And okay, so the people who participate on the study trips and SKB, they could, of course, talk as much as they want during 2 days, but it's still problematic because only a limited number of stakeholders could actually participate in these discussions because they were not at the study trip. So I would call this a discussion between a few stakeholders on closed arenas. It's not open and democratic in that sense. And it's also problematic because it's similar to a technocracy, because SKB presented technical data regarding their technologically advanced facilities using expert language, which is not really democratic maybe. But maybe the most problematic thing when it comes to study trips is like, how can SKB document all questions and answers raised by the public during a 2-day trip in the documentation they have to hand in as when they say, oh, this is our public consultation, but how do you document 2 days of comments and questions and stuff like that? So, yeah. But there is hope, I would say, also. We should not only be sad here, because there are, of course, things that you could do to make these processes more democratic. When it comes to representative democracy, it's fairly easy, because that means that local and national politicians have to participate at the meetings or in the process, so they can answer questions raised towards them. When it comes to discourse democracy, SKB or whatever company responsible here have to send out the agenda, which should be discussed in good time, so that the participants can prepare comments and questions. And also SKB or a neutral part have to make sure that no one is talking too much during the meetings. We have to make sure that everyone who would like to say something feels safe to do that. It has to be a friendly environment. And we have to make sure that all comments and questions are treated equally. There should be no preferences for expert language or arguments. We have to make sure that all meetings ends in time, so that no one has to leave before the meeting is, or before the discussion is over. And when it's come to technocracy, I would like to talk about different kinds of experts, because there is local expertise, people who have local knowledge about the place where you would like to build the facility operation. And then we have academic expertise. And then we have core expertise. Core expertise is people who are expert on the exact subject or area discussed. So if you're talking about problems with the head, we should only consult people who are experts on that, not doctors who are experts on feet or something like that. And then we have layman experts. And the layman expert is a person who doesn't have an academic degree, but who have been studying or have been engaged in the subject area for such a long time, but he or she has gained expert knowledge. So you should treat these people in the same way as you treat the academic experts. My conclusion after studying the EIA process with nuclear waste for 7 years is that it's not enough to create arenas and invite the public and environmental organizations to participate in the public consultation process. The process and the meeting also have to be organized in a democratic way. Anyways, if someone is interested in learning more, you could follow the link attached here and read my English summary of my thesis. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hannah. And please stop sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your detailed presentation.
Thank you.
I'm sure people will have a lot of questions for you.
Thank you.
I just want to go through quickly 1 or 2 questions raised by Mr. Rajendra Kumar Agarwal and Mr. Shobhit Srivastava. Now they are asking how to keep people away, how to keep away people who are not affected by the project in question. How to ensure that the point put up by public are genuine or affected or by external agencies have some vested interest. No.
I mean, it's difficult.
You are talking about people with, Hannah, this is not, this question is not for you. Question and answer will start after some time. These are for, so I just want to say, very easy to put doubts over the intention of people coming and participating. I also, the other side of the coin is, if industry, a project proponent is genuine, then why he is hesitant to answer to anyone, whether project affected or outside. So let's not waste our time in such silly discussion. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Tail Kazumba and Ms. Cindy Barger from US EPA. I request please Kazumba to share your presentation.
Can you see the presentation yet?
Yeah, we can see it, yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ntali Kajumba. I work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency along with Cindy Barger, and I will be highlighting some basic information about the U.S.'s environmental review process, particularly as it aligns with public participation, as well as some helpful methodologies used by federal agencies in the U.S. to engage underserved and vulnerable populations in the environmental review process. So the US's environmental review process is called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. It was actually enacted by Congress in December of 1969. This particular piece of legislation garnered tremendous support by Congress and was subsequently signed into law by then President Nixon on January 1st, 1970. NEPA was one of the world's first comprehensive national policies on the environment, and I think arguably one of the most successful. NEPA is broad in its consideration of environmental and natural resource impacts along with socioeconomics. It is primarily a procedural law designed to incorporate environmental planning into federal decision-making processes and engage the public, as well as disclose that those federal agencies are making on the environment to that same public. NEPA does not mandate a particular result, nor does it a specific outcome. So this slide is showing the broadness of the NEPA. This is the NEPA umbrella. And within our process, there's a requirement to integrate the requirements of both NEPA with other planning and environmental review procedures. And to the left, you'll see some statutes that we have that are very resource specific, like our Clean Air Act, our Clean Water Act, our National Historic Act, as well as some executive orders, including 12898 on environmental justice, our coordination with Indian tribal governments and children's health. All of these are integrated into our process when it's applicable. The next slide talks about some of the minimum standards for when to engage the public in our process. And this is for our major federal actions that we call environmental impact statements. So we engage the public during our scoping process. I think this is similar to the Indian process, their scoping. And we have a recommended time frame of 45 days for public scoping comments. Sometimes there are meetings held during this period. People can give their feedback in multiple ways. There are times when people miss the scoping process, but I think this is certainly the most critical time, if not before, to provide your comments if you're a stakeholder interested in a project. Then we go to the draft stage. Now, before the draft, agencies that are trying to have an effective engagement with the public will rise scoping comments and incorporate that information in the draft EIS. The public will then have a minimum of 45 days to provide their feedback. And there's typically a public hearing that is included in this timeframe. Then we move to publishing the final EIS, which should incorporate and contain all of the public comments, as well as responses to those comments. And this is a minimum review period of about 30 days. And following that, a record of decision is signed, and that is made available to the public. Now, more recently in our process, there are certainly sectors where we're now combining final environmental impact statements with records of decision. And when those two processes are combined, that certainly minimizes the opportunities for meaningful engagement of the public. So that engagement needs to occur much more robustly and much more effectively earlier on in the process at scoping and pre-scoping. Even before that, if you want to have a robust draft EIS that has addressed most of the concerns. So our next slide is just a summary of some of the key points. Our statute is primary procedural. For major actions, we develop EISs that talk about effects to the environment. We also have other documents for smaller projects. There has to be public engagement for those broader documents, but please understand about only 1% of our projects are major federal actions. The remainder are either done as environmental assessments or something even smaller that we call categorical exclusions. NEPA requires federal agencies like ours to consider the environmental issues and socioeconomic impacts of our actions before we make a decision. Our next slide highlights one of our executive orders that we call environmental justice. And this focuses on minority and low income populations, which are some of our most vulnerable populations that we have here in the United States. So this executive order requires that we identify minority and low income population and address any disproportionately high and adverse impacts appropriately that to their human health or their environment associated with programs, policies, and activities that may affect EJ populations. So this is a requirement that we integrate into our NEPA process. This EO also provides underserved communities and specifically low income and minority communities a framework for accessing public information and more fully engaging and participating in the public process. Because as federal agencies, we know that we've got to comply with this executive order. The EO also establishes an interagency working group on environmental justice, which includes a NEPA committee that has developed a useful guide that we call Promising Practices for EJ Methodologies in NEPA Review, and we'll highlight some of that shortly. But I think it's also important to note that that same IWG has a subcommittee that focuses primarily on public participation. And I think that would also be a good resource to connect with if this is an area of interest as well. So this slide just talks about the synergy and the nexus between NEPA and EJ. There's a lot of common themes. So analyzing and informing the public about environmental, social, and economic conditions, providing the public with opportunities to meaningfully engage and participate in decisions that impact them, particularly their environment, their health, or their communities, and promote equitable treatment as well as healthy and sustainable communities for all people. Now, this slide is just an illustration of the tool that we have developed as a committee. There were 13 different federal agencies that came together, including the Council on Environmental Quality, which oversees the NEPA process in the US. And we engaged in a collaborative process to identify and share promising practices that could benefit agencies to integrate public concerns, particularly around those that were most vulnerable, and to become more effective in their interaction around environmental reviews and the decision-making process. So each section of this promising practices document provides 1, guiding principles, and 2, specific steps for considering environmental justice in NEPA. The document is structured to incorporate 9 separate sections that provide a framework for conducting an EJ analysis. And if you look at the chart, you'll see that this is a very iterative process. So we want to meaningfully engage our stakeholders, engage our communities, engage our public at the very beginning, and integrate them into scoping, which is one of the most critical times to integrate people into a project because you have more influence as to the outcome at that point. Meaningfully engage them in defining and identifying our alternatives, engaging them in the affected environment and figuring that out, assessing what communities may be affected, what resources are present, engaging them in the self-identification of populations that may exist within that particular environment. And then as we're looking at impacts, the public should be engaged in that process as well. And then finally, we talk about disproportionately high and adverse impacts, which is a requirement of our executive order to make sure that if we identify any high and adverse impacts, that we disclose them, we try to make efforts to address them. And that takes us to our next step, where mitigation and monitoring or adaptive management are discussed. So this is just some further detail about the report. So when we talk about meaningfully engaging communities, and I think this is certainly the key area when we think about public participation, it needs to be ongoing, it needs to be early, and it needs to be done often. You know, we see a lot of the checking the box philosophy with public engagement from agencies, and we're trying to change that. So that is certainly an area that we can make more robust. So meaningfully engaging communities means that we need to develop strategies that take into account public outreach, and public outreach that considers any barriers to the public's engagement in your process, whether it be language, whether it be educational attainment or technology, or just the understanding of the technical issues like we just talked about. So as federal agencies and other stakeholders that are interested in this process, we've got to remain flexible and innovative in our approach to meaningful engagement. Then we get into scoping, where we're all trying to identify the key issue areas that need to be addressed. We talk about methodologies and data requirements. And at this point, we're trying to scope out the communities that may be impacted by our actions, you know, whether it be resources that they think are significant, or from a natural environment or social or cultural or historic. These are the areas that we want to focus on. And that document goes into a great deal of detail and strategies and steps that can be used. Next, we go into defining environment, the existing environment. And so we use our public to help us do that. Of course, we have screening tools and ground truthing and I think it's important to note that there are times when cultural knowledge and local knowledge is more relevant. I'm thinking about a project I worked on, and we had all kinds of tools, and we're able to miss a lot of native Indian mounds and some of the wetland areas that we had in the Delta part of Mississippi. However, we didn't get a lot of the things that were important to the community that had cemeteries and other resources that we wouldn't have known about, that weren't on any chart, and our project would have gone right through them. So having the community and the public engaged in that process becomes extremely relevant. Our next piece of our report talks about the identification and the identification of populations. You know, in NEPA, we're concerned about all populations, defining all populations, but we also have a requirement to identify specific vulnerable populations as well. And these are the minority and low-income populations. And so we talk about various methodologies that can be used to identify these two populations. And these methodologies vary across different federal agencies. So we talked about those that we thought were most meaningful, and then as well as any reference communities that you need to compare these your particular project site to as well. So there's a lot of data, there's a lot of potential sites and resources that we incorporate in this part of the document that we'll share with you if it hasn't already been shared. And then finally, we get to our analysis. Our alternatives analysis is the heart of the NEPA process. We're trying to make sure that we develop and select alternatives that meet both the purpose and need of the action, but also minimize impacts to the public as well as to the environment. And so it is through this triaging that the public really needs to be engaged in framing and helping us to figure out how to avoid sites or that may adversely impact them while meeting the needs of either the applicant or the federal agencies. Our impact assessment process talks about, is really built on our scoping piece. And so we're further refining, we're getting into detailed quantification of our impacts as well as qualitative impacts. And so we're looking at specific data sources here. We think it's important to incorporate things like health as well into our decision-making processes where we have that information available. And so this is talked about in a great deal of detail with suggestions about how agencies can better conduct an impact analysis. And then ultimately we come to the disproportionately high and adverse impacts. We give a variety of definitions. What does this mean? We talk about various methodologies, two specifically that are used in conducting a DHAI analysis. And then a decision is made in all documents as to whether or not we think we're going to have disproportionately high and adverse impacts. If we do, we need to move on to thinking about how can we mitigate for those impacts? Is additional monitoring required, etc. And so remember, this is an iterative process, and it's really key that our public and our communities are engaged in developing their own innovative approaches to mitigation and monitoring, and that we're transparent with this phase of the process as well. We often document those in our records of decision if there are some requirements that need to be met, or there's something that's been negotiated, or their MOUs or MOAs that communities have developed as a result of their engagement in the federal decision-making process. And here are two projects that we've just highlighted that utilize a lot of extensive engagement. They were able to avoid and minimize a lot of impacts that came from significant projects like port expansions and container terminal transfer facilities that had significant impacts on the communities, but they were engaged in the process and came up with a community benefits agreement or appropriate mitigation to address their issues. And with that, I will close. This is another resource from a community perspective about how to engage in the process that I would also like to share at a later date. And with that, I'll turn it over to questions, comments, or suggestions.
Thank you, Ms. Kazumba. Thank you very much for the detailed presentation. Kindly stop sharing your presentation. Thank you very much. Now I am going to take few questions, and in between I request Ishita to work with Mr. Ebenezer to share his presentation. Let me just share something. I have got a very good comment from
Have I stopped sharing?
Yeah, I have got again, Miss Tarini Manchanda. She says, sometimes affected people may not be able to analyze the environmental impact of a project since they are not involved in those subjects. Sometimes only those with a background in social and ecological science can discuss those impacts, and in those cases, what does EIA include for these aspects? Now I have a very good question from Ms. Ruha Das. It will be great like if Ms. Kazumba can reply to it. Now she is asking, in case there is a project where people are not happy with it, however, it gets clearance. So now what are the options available to people in US?
Okay. There are times, and, we hope it's rare times where projects get through. Certainly public participation and involvement is part of the decision-making process, but it doesn't mean that a project won't move through just because there's some opposition to it. There may be other constraints, political constraints at times. It's more rare, but it happens. We've recently gone through that ourselves. And so at that point, the public really still wants to be on the record. You want to have voiced your concerns in a vibrant manner, because you never know. Other groups may take up your cause. It may be environmental groups. It could be other stakeholders. We also have other mechanisms that I don't necessarily like to bring up, but there's such a thing as a litigation, and that's a last resort, but it happens from time to time where the public says, hey, or a nonprofit says you did not follow the procedures correctly. We voiced our concerns. We don't feel like we were appropriately heard. And we don't agree with this decision. You didn't follow the process, right? So that gets decided by a then court of law, by a judge. Cindy, do you have anything else that you think to add to that?
Yeah, I think the other one that we do have is we have it's called the Council for Environmental Quality. It's an office that sits within the office of our president, and they have an oversight ability. So if, for example, let's say a federal agency there's concerns that they may not be doing their analysis correctly, and it gets raised, it typically gets raised by another federal agency, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, but we might be raising that on behalf of concerns that we see that public concerns aren't being adequately considered, that they're being dismissed. It also may go directly to that council, and then they can engage and facilitate discussion. So it's a conflict resolution process that they can be involved in and have been involved in. I don't know if it's made the news in your area, but we've had, it's called Dakota Access Pipeline. It was a large pipeline that was impacting Native Americans, and the Council for Environmental Quality got involved with that agency in trying to figure out what the appropriate level of analysis would be. So it also ended up with litigation. So it kind of had several avenues. I also wanted just to quickly, the comment somebody asked regarding the level of detail, and when the information is so technical, it might be difficult for the public. That's also one of the things that we in the US really try to do with our documents, and we try in our role as the EPA when we're reviewing other agencies' documents, is making sure that that information is accessible, so that it's translated in a way that the person in the neighborhood can understand it, that they don't have to be a technical expert. You have the technical experts that are doing the analysis, but then we pull in a public communications experts that can help translate that in a manner that's understandable. And it's important to be able to have that. Most of our agencies have those experts on staff that they utilize, and they work closely with their communities in order to make sure it's understandable.
Yeah, I think that's
just one, Ms. Kazumba, just 1 minute. Let me ask Mr. Ebenezer to share his presentation. Mr. Ebenezer, are you there? Can you switch on your video? Mr. Ebenezer?
I'm here. Navit, I'm here.
Yeah, please
Okay.
share your presentation.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Ebenezer from Environmental Protection Agency, Ghana.
Yes. Thank you, Navit. And I just want to show my face, and then you can Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, participants and fellow panelists. Public
Mr.
participation.
Ebenezer,
Hello.
Can you just make your presentation full screen from the
I
bottom?
should. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you okay?
Fine, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, fine. Okay. Public participation is an essential part of our EIA experience in Ghana. And it starts from the provisions, several legal provisions that have been made to ensure that public participation plays a key role in environmental impact assessments and the various decisions that come out of it. From my screen, you can see there are several legal frameworks that make public participation an essential part of decision making. We have particularly our constitution, the 1992 constitution makes the right to information a human right, and for that matter, provides an opportunity for the citizenry to participate in decision making. And this flows through to other regulatory frameworks. We have the EPA Act also providing for that, the Land Use and Spatial Planning Act. You have the Local Governance Act. All these legal frameworks make it mandatory for participate in various decision making. When it comes to the National Environment Policy, that sets the framework for the EIA system that we operate. Its public participation is the bedrock of the environmental governance system in Ghana, and it enshrines several provisions for us to ensure that the public participates in various decisions. With respect to environmental impact assessment, the Environmental Assessment Regulations 1999, LI 1652, provides adequate provisions at every stage of the EIA process. And my next slide tries to give a sense of what happens at each of the stages. From the registration stage, where a proponent is required to register an intention to develop a project, and also applying for an environmental permit, one of the key requirements is that in the course of, they have to show evidence of consultation with key persons or the public who are likely to be affected. And there are various tools that have been applied in practice. You have the one-on-one discussions with various persons who live within the community where the projects will take place. The other means of engaging them. And then we have once we receive these applications for registration of the proposals, we have to do screening. We screen to determine the next level of assessment, or whether a decision can be taken at that stage, depending on the scale, the nature of the project, as well as the receiving environment. At the screening stage, our law requires that the public concerns should be one of the key considerations in arriving at the screening decision. And during that period, we use various approaches. Again, you engage immediate neighbors to the project site. You write letters to regulatory institutions to give an opinion on the project and where it's being cited. We would also organize meetings where needed, so that we can have the concerns of the public well documented, and then it becomes part of the decision-making process. Again, when a decision is made for an environmental impact assessment to be done, a detailed assessment to be conducted, then the proponent is required by our law to undertake scoping. And at the scoping stage, The LI 1652 is very clear about what should happen in terms of public participation. There are several instruments that have been outlined in the LI, including, first of all, notification to the relevant public or government agencies with responsibility for the project that you are doing to be notified of the scoping process. There's also the requirement for public notices to be posted in one national newspaper and a newspaper of the locality where the project is taking place. There's a requirement for extensive consultations with other key stakeholders within the community. And these notices will have to be posted and ensure that enough opportunity is given for the public to participate. Again, once the scoping report has been prepared, the law requires that it should be posted within the community where the project will be undertaken, to give access to the communities to participate, as well as the general public to have access to the document and raise concerns, if any. After the scoping stage, the environmental impact assessment study is also another stage where there are minimum requirements, where again, extensive consultations by the proponent in the course of preparing the study. There are also the requirements to build on what has happened during the scoping stage. Various means are used. There are town hall meetings, one-on-one discussions. You can use social media, electronic media. The key thing at this stage is also to ensure that the concerns raised are well documented and they are reflected in the study to ensure that the EIA responds to the various concerns and demonstrates how those concerns have been dealt with or will be dealt with in the course of implementation of the project. Once the agency receives the draft EIA report, in this case, the environmental impact statement, there's a requirement to publish it, put up a notice in the newspapers for 21 days, allowing the public to review the document, and then within 21 days, submit any concerns or comments that they have on the project. Now, form, sometimes you have communities also raising concerns, which they can sometimes walk to the offices to express them, but most of them come in the form of various in letters, petitions, and all that on the project. The agency is also enjoined to hold public hearings where, in our view, we think that the impact of the project will have far-reaching consequences, where there will be relocation and resettlement, and where there will be diversion of streams, of various water bodies, and where there are strong public objections to the project, then we are required to undertake public hearing. This is also enshrined in the LI 1652. In terms of decision making, once a decision is made, we are required to gazette the notice. Yes.
Please speed up.
Oh, yeah, I'll speed up. Almost there. We are enjoined to gazette the decision that has been made, and in doing all this, the idea is to give the public the opportunity to be part of these processes. There are appeal provisions for decisions that the public are not happy with, and that has to go to our minister responsible for it. Doing all this, there are various challenges to it. The issue of culture, language, and language barriers are there. Sometimes it's not easy for you to undertake consultation. Stakeholder party is also there. We have issues with not in my backyard syndrome. So irrespective of the opportunity to participate in the process, there's that resistance to be open and be part of the process. We have sometimes institutional and bureaucracies that also impact on these processes. There was a particular filling station that the agency had to address issues when the public raised objections, and it had to do with the sacred site, which was close to the proposed state site. It caused delays because the consultation was not enough. It led to a redesign of the whole place and introduced very stringent requirements when the decision was made to go on with the project. I would say that what have been some of the responses to the challenges that we have, we think that there's the need for the development of clear public participation guidelines that will set the boundaries and the processes out very well for everybody to be part of and to be able to measure the extent of consultation. That has been done. There's also the need to create awareness and build the capacity among various key stakeholders to be able to participate when the opportunity is given. The involvement of local civil society organizations is very critical. They sometimes can raise the issues on behalf of the various communities who are unable to really be part of these processes, maybe because of the constraints that are engaged in. Usually you have very technical documents which have to be broken down into the language that people can understand and be part of the process. We also need to develop more modern tools for public participation in the midst of digitization of our various processes. We need to review the legal instruments to reflect practice. Over 20 years of practice, some of the provisions in our laws appear not to be very effective and they need to be refined. And of course, also to document best practices that we have as a guidance to upcoming projects. In conclusion, I think that we've learned a lot of lessons. They need to define stakeholders and then to be able to determine the adequacy of consultations. Usually they'll come back and say, we were not adequately consulted, and it's very difficult to define it. Lack of consultations also lead to public protests and lawsuits, which has the potential to stall various projects. They need to get the buy-in of stakeholders to ensure that at all stages of the process. And then we also need to maintain a balance between some technical considerations and public consent. Sometimes working that balance is very difficult when the public have very strong objections, but can be addressed through technical designs and the way the project is implemented. Yet they have that resistance to the project. And the last but not the least, they need to develop a more effective feedback system. And that has always been a challenge. When having gone through all these processes, the public want to know what we did with the concerns that they raised in the other various stages. And I think that that is a very critical thing that we need to do. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ebenezer.
Right.
I had some idea about EIA process in Ghana, but didn't know that you have got a detailed mechanism where you are engaging with the local community from the very first stage. It's really interesting, and I would like to learn more from you in future.
Thank you.
I request all the panelists to share their screen. I will just have quick question with few of them. My next question is to Ms. Kazumba. Ms. Kazumba, you have talked about engagement with the local community. Now, my question is, what are the different modes of communication, engagement? It is through phone, email, or you visit them, do survey. What are the modes of engagement? Ms. Kazumba.
And Tali, you're muted.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, we have a suite of potential ways to engage these. So, you know, now we're primarily in an age of technology post-COVID. So a lot of that is technology-based. through phones, through apps, but there's still a lot of meetings that are occurring just socially distanced. In regular times, we go out to communities. Sometimes I've had projects, we're not necessarily always the lead in the project, but we have connections with community leaders, and we'll get them to help us facilitate meetings and convene the community and bring the other representatives, the other federal agencies, states, anyone that may be applicable to resolving or addressing a particular issue, and then have a discussion, a dialogue with them. So there are many multiple ways of engaging the community. You just have to assess what the needs of that specific stakeholder group are, because it doesn't always work the same. I remember going to a meeting and transportation, and they had green light, red light, yellow light, 2 minutes to talk per person. And this did not go over well because this was a community that was elderly, culturally different. They didn't feel comfortable, especially the elders, getting up, standing in front of the thing and having this light change colors on them, And the great thing about the facilitator at the time was that he recognized that it only was addressing one subpopulation. And so he slowly at the end went and sat down with stakeholders and said, you know what, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back tomorrow and we're going to sit in smaller groups. And he had them talking in smaller groups and engaging them in a way, showing them models, showing them things in a personal way. So when we talk about tools for engagement vary. And we have a number of documents that we can share that highlight the various ways that we can engage communities. Cindy, I don't know if you have anything else.
Yeah, I can also just share, before I worked for EPA, I worked for one of the agencies that would develop the environmental impact statements in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, we have very diverse communities, very culturally different. The Native Hawaiians have a very unique way in how they feel comfortable in communicating with people and communicating their concerns. And so what we did is we contacted leaders in the Native Hawaiian community, and we had them help us design like our public meetings and our process to where we talked with them in a way that they felt comfortable. So we didn't do we had several public meetings, but we didn't do it like a normal kind of public meeting. We had it more like a kind of a discussion. So kind of like what Nantali was saying, where we had little stations where people could go and talk to those experts. Like if it was an expert on plants, if it was an expert on air, an expert on water, to have a little bit more one-on-one. We even made sure that when we opened the ceremony, or the meeting, we practiced the traditional ceremonies, and we had an elder open it with a prayer. So we made it designed in a way that worked for that community. And I think that's one of the beauties that we do have with our NEPA Act, is it tells you need to engage. It gives you a minimum standard, but it allows, you can always do more. I did see one comment about people kind of moving too quickly. We have that issue too. We have some agencies that are very much about schedule, and they'll want to move very quickly. And one of the things is we try and educate them on taking the time helps in the long run, and it actually saves time and money in the long run. So you might take longer to get to your decision, but it's going to be more successful. And sometimes that's more education and more effort to educate that individual or that agency than others that are more open to it.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. I just have a comment from Ms. Anima Sharma. It is really a matter of concern that though there are several talks about community-led participation, bottom-up approach, still when it comes to development, it is done in a very hasty manner. Unfortunately, it's correct, Amina. I want to take a question from my dear friend, Mr. Cisse from Swaziland. And this question is for Hannah. In case where concerns are raised and documented in the EIA report, but the proponent chooses to ignore these concerns during implementation, what is the procedure in Sweden?
So the company would like to start a facility or a plant, something like that. We apply, let's say, to the environmental court. Let's make it easy in this case. So we apply to the environmental court. And usually it's a hearing in the environmental court, and they can say their opinion in the environmental court, and then the environmental court or the government makes the final decision. So I think that's the only way, actually, if we're invited to the court and if we are allowed to raise their voice in the court. I think that's the only legal way to do it in Sweden. Okay, but it doesn't mean that the court is changing their mind, but at least they can say their opinion.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Ebenezer. Mr. Ebenezer, in case, please unmute yourself. In case people are standing up against any process, so what regulator and project proponent do in such case scenario when people stand up against any project?
Come again. David, can you come again?
If there is a strong protest against any
project, yes.
If there is a strong protest against any project in Ghana, what regulators and project proponents do in such scenario?
Good. There's always the opportunity to bring the parties together. The fact that there's a protest shows that the consultation has not been adequately dealt with. So we as an agency would organize a meeting, bring the two sides together, and then hear the proponent, the protest, what is it about, and then give the opportunity to the proponent to respond. Sometimes we can even bring on board other regulators who have some relevance to the project to be part of the team that would hear the parties. At the end of the day, we will try to come to some conclusions. If there's an agreement or the fact that we think that the protest, the concerns raised can be addressed, then we document them, issue the necessary letters to that effect, instructing the proponent to take those issues on board within certain time frames. Sometimes you can ask them for a plan to address the issue over a period, which we agreed to, and then issue official letters to that effect. We also follow it up with some periodic monitoring of the implementation of what has been agreed on, and to ensure that we all keep our side of our commitments. Sometimes there's no agreement, and we keep working on it till we get to the point where if it's not working, we take a decision, and then the protesters can go to the next level. They can appeal to the minister. They can even go to the courts to seek further redress. But in many cases, we're able to come to some consensus on the way forward.
Thank you, Mr. Ebenezer. And I just now would like to conclude here. It was really a very informative evening. I could see the difference between public engagement process in India, Ghana, Sweden, and US EPA. And I could realize if, like, when you talk about India, we talk about signing India and rising India. These slogans will die soon if we don't recognize the impact of a project which has on the local people. This webinar teaches me that India needs to move away from ineffective public consultation process to active public engagement process. Then only sentiment, which is prevailing across the country against development project, will stop. I am thankful to all my panelists, Isita, Hanna, Cindy, Kazumba, Mr. Ebenezer. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and we will continue engaging with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.